I am decidedly of the opinion, and will present a very vigorous case, that brain death is not the death of the person, that it is not something that is appropriate to use clinically, and that we need to have more objective certitude about the moment of death. And I would advocate for other criteria used to determine death, which we can talk about. We have the traditional cardiopulmonary criteria. We also have Dr. Paul Byrne's suggestion, which I think is a brilliant suggestion, which is that we should define death based on the destruction of the three critical systems of the body. Okay, the circulatory system, the respiratory system, and the nervous system. So I just want to clarify that at the beginning before I get into the meat and potatoes of this argument that I'm presenting, which I believe philosophically, theologically, morally is a compelling argument. I think that it's the best argument and that it deserves a listening ear by particularly as we're called to form consciences, right? Just because the church hasn't spoken definitively about brain death doesn't mean that it's indifferent. We still have to follow our Lord. We still have to follow our conscience. We still have to use reason. We still have to do what we can to advocate for the death of the human person. And people have to make then decisions within the boundaries of what the church allows them to. I do want to say one thing about this argument that, many people will say, and the church in several documents has suggested that it's up to medical professionals to determine the criteria for death. We know theologically that death is the separation of the soul from the body. But of course, the soul is immaterial. You can't see the soul. So what are the medical criteria? What are the medical tests that confirm that a person has died? Many people, and as I mentioned in church documents, the church has suggested, well, it's up to medical professionals to determine this. But I'm going to just be a little provocative here. I think that, quite frankly, is not a sustainable position. And I think that the church will eventually need to take a position on this issue because it's, in my judgment, it's a failure of moral leadership if the church doesn't speak definitively into this truth. And the reason why is because I'll speak by analogy. What if the church were to say, we don't know when human life begins. We're going to leave it up to medical professionals to determine the beginning of human life. Well, you can't say abortion is wrong because you're not clarifying that life begins at conception. If the doctor says it's a blob of tissue, or it's not clear that it's actually a person, or any of the other pro-choice arguments out there, which we're very familiar with, right? We wouldn't be able to have a culture of life. We wouldn't be able to teach, as the church does, that human life begins at the moment of conception, that abortion is intrinsically immoral, right? It's because the church has taken a moral position and said life begins at conception. That is a fundamental truth. We have the authority as the church to define that we can educate people about that we can form them, that we can teach that we can live that out. So for the church to say, on the one hand, human life begins at conception, you cannot kill an unborn child. That is murder. It's a grave offense against the dignity of the human person. And on the other hand, we don't really know when life ends. We leave it up to medical professionals to determine. You see the inconsistency there, right? This is not clear. People have a right to know, is my relative alive or dead? Is my patient alive or dead? Am I alive or dead, right? This is something that there is a fundamental moral aspect to the question. The question of, is a person dead or alive? Yes, there's a medical component to that question. There's a biological component. It's also a spiritual question. It's also a question that has to do with our ultimate identity in God. It has to do with the rights that we're able to exercise, because the moment we're declared dead, we have no more rights. We have no more legal rights. We have no more self-autonomy at that point. So this question of the criteria to determine death is not strictly a medical question. It's also a spiritual question that the church should speak into. So I'm going to be, for those of you that are interested, I have an article coming out in the Lineker Quarterly in August. And the title of the article is "The Moral Illicitness of Relying Solely on Neurological Criteria for the Determination of Death, a Catholic Response to Brain Death." So I am going to be presenting a rigorous refutation of the idea that brain death is consistent with Catholic teaching, which is a very controversial position. As I mentioned, you are not obligated to believe that. The Catholic Church allows you to accept brain death at this point in time, but it's an open question in the church. And I do very much believe that this is the better argument and that this is ultimately the direction that the church needs to go. So I'm going to present an argument that's both philosophical, theological, and moral, as well as medical and biological, that brain death or death by neurological criteria is not equivalent to the death of the human person as a whole. Okay, so and if you all have questions, as Maria mentioned, there's a chat box. You're welcome to type your questions, and I will try to the best of my ability, respond to them and incorporate them in this presentation. So I want to first, I want to go to sort of the medical piece, the biological component of the argument. Since I'm speaking to nurses, I'm going to start with the tangible medical biological component. And the reason for this also is I think this is a question of methodology, right? That many times you talk to people about brain death or other bioethics issues, and they want to start with the philosophical, theological ideas. But the danger is that sometimes, scholars, and I'm a scholar, so can take self-criticism here. Sometimes they like to do thought experiments. What if this? And they like to play gotcha, right? What if you had this situation and you had a patient that was connected to this, but and they give this elaborate situation and they're trying to do a thought experiment and try and analyze these things. But the things they're talking about are so disconnected from reality. You're living in outer space. This is where most people are living. Is I got a patient in front of me and I need to know how to help this patient, and you're out doing thought experiments about X, Y, and Z. There's a role for that, right? I'm not against scholarship. Certainly these things need to be debated and we need to think through them. But I think that if we take a methodology which starts out in the abstract, we're going to miss the fundamental reality Jesus wants us to understand, right? That death is not a subjective construct, right? Contrary to what the American Neurology Association and other groups think, is not a social construct, right? It is an objective biological reality. It is something that since the beginning of human civilization, we know what it is. When you see somebody that's really dead, they don't have a pulse, they turn pale, the life goes out of them. Even a child can identify that the person is truly dead based on the traditional criteria. Okay, so I want to speak into the biological medical piece of this first, and then we'll get into the philosophical, the theological, and how that dovetails and can make a compelling argument for what is the truth with respect to the moment of death. And what we'll find, and something I'll argue for, is that many times it's not clear exactly when the moment of death is, that it's not always precisely possible to pinpoint an exact moment. And so that's something that we'll have to grapple with as we go through this discussion. Okay, so in the first place, I want to present to you the advent of brain death and where this comes from. Okay, so beginning really with a report from Harvard Medical School in 1968. The title of this report is A Definition of Irreversible Coma. Okay, now you notice the terminology. It says irreversible coma. We know that people in a coma are not dead, they're alive. Okay, so there's already a contradiction in this report, is that they're setting forth a criteria of death by referring to those that are in a coma and living. So there's an internal contradiction in the very title of this report. Well, if we read this report, what the doctors at Harvard say, this is 1968, so imagine 50 years ago, this is the advent, for all practical purposes, of the neurological criteria. These physicians say that we need to propose a new criteria of death, neurological death or brain death, for two reasons they list. The first reason they say is that with the advent of modern technology, people can stay on a ventilator for a very long time, and that's taking up hospital beds. And because of that, and the ability of modern medicine to sustain life, we need to have clearer definition of death. Well, from a Catholic understanding of the human person, that's a non-issue, right? And the reason I say it's a non-issue is because the church does not require extraordinary care. It allows it. If you want to stay hooked up to the ventilator and you don't have a reasonable chance of recovery, that's allowable, but it's not required. A Catholic can in good conscience say, I don't want extraordinary care, and they can die a natural death. So this argument from these doctors at Harvard that we need a new definition of death because of modern technology, from a Catholic perspective of the human person and Catholic teaching, no, that doesn't follow. People don't need to receive extraordinary care. We can keep the same criteria of death. That's not really a compelling reason. The second reason they give is, I think, the real reason. And that reason is because there's not enough people giving organs. So this has to do with organ transplants, right? And these physicians are saying, by the time we get these organs, they're no good. There are not enough organ donors. The amount of people requesting organs far outpaces the organs available. So we need to come up with a criteria of death which makes it easier to obtain organs for transplant. Now, whatever you think about the praiseworthiness or not of that goal, what I want to focus on is that it's a utilitarian goal. It has nothing to do with the accuracy, the biological, philosophical, theological reality of human death. It has to do with a social, pragmatic goal. And as I mentioned, this is a hallmark of the culture of life. We live in a utilitarian culture in which, many people believe that the ends justify the means. Now, the Catholic Church teaches definitively that the ends do not justify the means, that moral actions need to be moral in and of themselves. In other words, the teaching of the Catholic Church, just to be crystal clear on what the church does teach, is that in order to give a vital unpaired organ like a heart, okay, the patient has to be dead. It's called the dead donor rule. This is a fundamental aspect of Catholic ethics. The reason is because if the person is not dead, you're killing them to take their organ and give it to another patient. That's euthanasia, according to Catholic social teaching.
So, Michael, can I just interrupt you for 1 second? Could you repeat that again? And where would someone find that information at?
Yeah, sure. So there's various pronouncements from the church about the dead donor rule. You can find it in the Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church. You can find it in the Catechism. There's various statements in Humani Vitae, Evangelium, well, not Humani Vitae, but Evangelium Vitae,
Okay.
There's a document of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith called Dignitatis Personae and Donum Vitae that talk about this. So this is an ordinary part of the magisterium of the church, right? This is not debated amongst Catholic ethicists. The dead donor rule is accepted across the board by faithful Catholic theologians and ethicists and by the magisterium of the church, right? You have to be, now understand, I'm not talking about a healthy person that wants to give a kidney. You have 2 kidneys. You can, if it doesn't harm you and there's consent, that can be licit and even morally praiseworthy. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about if you're giving a vital organ like a heart, you only have 1 heart, you have to be dead prior to the extraction of that organ. If they're killing you to take that organ from you and give it to another person, that's euthanasia, and that's morally illicit. It's homicide. So I want to be really, really clear about that. So although the Catholic Church has not spoken definitively about the criteria for death, we do have the dead donor rule, and the church does teach you have to be dead before the extraction of vital unpaired organs. Otherwise, you are in the territory of euthanasia.
Thank you. That's very clear. I mean, I really appreciate that. I think that's something we have to really hold on to as you continue on your presentation. Thank you.
Okay. So I want to, before I get into the biological medical argument, I want to share a quote with you. This is an English translation of a quote. The original was is in Italian. This was from Pope Benedict XVI. This was when he was Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger. And this was from the 14th of April, 1991. The former Pope said this: "There is a war of the powerful against the weak, which includes the putting to death of those who fall into an irreversible coma." Notice, he's using the exact same term that the physicians at Harvard used in their report in 1968. I'll repeat it again. The putting to death of those who fall into an irreversible coma, those who are brain dead, for organ transplants and medical research. So looking at this statement, right, we can see that Pope Benedict was not convinced that those declared brain dead are actually dead, right? Evidently, he did not take the step of defining that at the level of the institutional church, but he indicated in his statement that he is not personally convinced by this criteria. So those people who are arguing that this is a closed question in the church, no, it's not. The church has not definitively resolved this issue. It's an open discussion, and it's very important that that debate happens. John Paul had an address to the Transplantation Society in the year 2000. He said this: "Here it can be said that the criterion adopted," he's talking about the neurological criteria, "for ascertaining the fact of death, namely the complete and irreversible cessation of all brain activity." Okay, he's talking about whole brain death. There's a distinction within the advocates of brain death. Some of them are whole brain death. They believe it's the whole brain that has to be not functioning for the person to be declared dead. Some of them are in the higher brain death school, where they just believe if the person is unconscious, they can be declared dead. So even the people promoting brain death don't agree with themselves. So there's different schools of thought within those who are advocating for brain death. Okay, so just to give you some context here. Okay, he said if these criteria are rigorously applied, so he's putting a condition. He's saying if they're rigorously applied, it's estimated right now that there's about 30 different criteria and means for determining death within brain death. So how can something be rigorously applied if there's 30 different standards, right? So even if you accept brain death in principle, the practical aspect of it being done the correct way, you'd have to call into serious question. He says this understanding of brain death, he's talking about the philosophical aspect of it, does not seem, he says, to conflict with the essential elements of a sound anthropology. Okay, so he's stating a provisional opinion that he doesn't necessarily see a conflict between brain death and Catholic anthropology. I personally believe that in light of what we know today and what we've seen, the work of Dr. Alan Schumann and other esteemed neurologists and what they have discovered, that John Paul, if he were alive today, would, in my mind, I'd have no doubt, put a categorical ban on death by neurological criteria. But this is an open question in the church. This is a provisional opinion. The church has not in any official magisterial document definitively taught for or against brain death. So I do want to clarify that and then go into the formal argument here. So with respect to part one here that I want to present, which is the people declared brain dead, okay, they possess living bodies. And I want to review some of the evidence with you so I can make this clear and give an opportunity for reflection here. Okay, so this is all medical evidence. This is substantiated. This isn't coming from me. This is coming from neurologists and physicians, right, from all over the world. So I'm just presenting this to you. Generally speaking, people declared brain dead possess a beating heart and a functional circulatory system. So that means blood is pumping through their body. Respiration, some people say, well, they're not breathing. Well, that's true. They're on a ventilator. But respiration, if you look at the cellular level, is occurring. There's an exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide at the cellular level. So it's not true to say there's no respiration in those declared brain dead. There is respiration at the cellular level. Okay. Many times those declared brain dead, before they go through transplant surgery to have their organs harvested, their blood pressure rises and their heart rate increases. I don't know about you, but I don't know any dead people that have elevated heart rate and blood pressure. They can often digest food, filter race, and even maintain body temperature. Many women declared brain dead have given birth to healthy children. So there's a book that was edited by Paul Byrne, Michael Potts, and Richard Nilgis called The Case Against Brain-Based Criteria for Human Death. It was an edition of Philosophy and Medicine. All of these statistics are there. Schumann and other neurologists have presented this ad nauseum. This isn't debatable. This is the biological objective fact. People declared brain dead, quite frankly, to put it in layman's language, have more in common with living human beings than corpses. So that's the medical biological reality. Now, those arguing for brain death have a response to this. Okay, and they have many responses, but I'm going to try to summarize so that you get the lay of the land. They argue that the only reason this person has a heartbeat, the only reason they have elevated blood pressure, many times they have to give them sedatives when they do transplants, just like they would do for a living patient. If they're dead, why are you giving them a sedative to keep them from moving? Seems kind of strange. In fact, there was a survey done of medical professionals, and some stated that they didn't want to be involved in transplant for this reason, because they didn't believe that that the person was actually dead at the time of the transplant. But the response of those advocating for brain death is it's only because of the ventilator. You see, Michael, if they weren't hooked up to a ventilator, none of this would be happening. They would be dead. The ventilator, they said, is the reason why they have a heartbeat, they have blood pressure, they have a circulatory system, they have respiration at the cellular level. It's only because of the ventilator. Okay, and I'm going to be charitable here. This is a logical fallacy. Okay, and the reason that this argument is a logical fallacy is because, quite frankly, they're making the ventilator, which is keeping the person alive. There are a lot of people that were sick during the pandemic and COVID often had to be on a ventilator. There are PVS patients that have to be on a ventilator that are clearly not dead. There are other people that are injured that have to be on a ventilator for a certain period of time. The goal, of course, is to get them off the ventilator. But many people need a ventilator for their continued life. To say that because a person is on a ventilator, which is what keeps them alive, therefore they're dead, because the ventilator is what's keeping them alive. And in order to be a living human person, you can't have any support outside of yourself, from a machine, from another person. No, that's radical autonomy. That's not the criteria for the objective biological definition of death, right? It's precisely the ventilator that's keeping them alive. If they decide there's no reasonable hope of recovery, I don't want to be on a ventilator, you want to disconnect the ventilator and allow them to die a natural death, perfectly acceptable. But you want to keep them hooked up to a ventilator, rip the beating heart out of their chest and give it to another patient, not acceptable. What you've done is artificially keep the person alive and then killed them in a way that allows you to dispose of their organs, right? That is not morally licit. So the point here is that this argument that proponents of brain death are making, that it's only because of the ventilator, is completely irrelevant to whether the person is alive. So what? They're on a ventilator. That doesn't have to do with whether they're dead or alive. A lot of people that are alive need the support of a ventilator, right? So this confuses dependence on a ventilator with the biological objective criteria for death. It also presupposes there are people who are speculating that there is such a thing. I don't know if you've heard the term, but you've heard the term artificial life. Okay, biologically speaking, I'm not getting into the philosophy. Biologically speaking, there is no such thing as artificial life. Okay, the people that are declared brain dead, they have metabolism. They have what's referred to as autopoiesis, right? They have something in them is working. They need the assistance of a ventilator to sustain their life. So the reality that we're facing when we're talking about people that are declared dead by neurological criteria or brain dead is these are severely brain injured people. These are people that need compassion, they need love, they need tenderness. The fact in and of itself that they're on a ventilator does not mean that they're dead. There needs to be a biological objective proof that they are dead. I don't know about all of you, but ordinary person does not see a beating heart and think this person is dead. Dead people don't have beating hearts. They don't. Dead people don't have metabolism. Dead people don't give birth to children. When you have women being declared brain dead and then they give birth to a healthy child, how is that possible that a dead person gave life to a child?
Right, Michael, I just wanted to interrupt too. During one of your Christ Medicus meetings, one of the people on the board, didn't they share about an article where they're thinking about using, or who they claim is brain dead women, to be able to facilitate caring, to be surrogate moms, to be surrogates, to have babies?
Yeah, so there are ethicists now who are proposing, and they're serious. I mean, I'm not making light of this. They're very serious. They're proposing that people declared brain dead could be used as incubators to give birth to children, as a way of helping to facilitate the birth of children. We know that with the industry of IVF, there's children being created outside the womb in test tubes, which is an egregious abuse of the human person. And now, lo and behold, it comes to find out that since these people have already been declared dead and they're still biologically able to give birth to children, maybe science can use them to help with infertility. And I'm not making this up. There are ethicists that are talking about this. There's articles written about it. But this tells you how far our culture has come.
It's very scary. Thank you. I just wanted to share that because that's how far we've gone is right. It's scary. Thank you.
Yeah. So just to review this, right, that many people need a ventilator, and we should not conflate the philosophical position of radical autonomy, which is that a person can't be dependent on anyone outside of themselves for their life, with the biological death of the human person. Okay, so in light of the biological evidence, I want to go a little further with the biological evidence before we go into the philosophical piece. But in light of the biological evidence, we have to say, in truth, I believe that those declared brain dead have living bodies. I don't see any other way around it. Dr. Alan Schumann has provided, he's a neurologist that was in favor of brain death and had a conversion, changed his mind because of the patients that he was seeing. He has shown compelling medical biological evidence that those declared brain dead can live for hundreds of days. So we're not talking about somebody's declared dead and within a short period of time, they die. These are people who, when they're hooked up to a ventilator, could live for 100 days, 200 days, 250 days. You have to wonder, if they're really dead, how is it that their life is able to be sustained for such a long period of time, right? There seems to be a conflict here. And so just to continue with the biological argument here, those advocating for brain death argue that the brain is the central integrator of the human body. When the functioning of the brain ceases, they say the human being dies. Okay, but the fact is, right, that there is no convincing biological medical argument that the brain is the center of the human person. All right. And the reason I say this is because the heart can continue to beat without the brain. Respiration still occurs at the cellular level, and the digestive system still works. There's a lot in the human person that works. The idea behind brain death is that the thing that holds the whole human person together is the brain. Biologically, medically speaking, they have not proven it. Okay, there are people who try to argue for this philosophically and theologically, and I'm going to address those arguments and refute them. But purely on the medical biological plane, we do not have compelling evidence that the brain is the central integrator of the human person. That has not been medically established. Okay, they want to treat the brain as a master control system. This is similar to the field of mechanical and control engineering. But the brain, the human person, is a living body, right? Not a machine, right? And so there's a real concern with transhumanism that you're going to try to treat the person as a machine and improve upon human nature. I would argue that many of those arguing for brain death are implicitly doing that by virtue of their arguments, that they are, in fact, they are treating the brain as the master computer controlling the human person. And that position, whatever merits it has philosophically or theologically, which I would strongly debate, is not a medical biological argument. So if we're looking at this from the role of medicine and biology, we do not have compelling certain evidence that brain death equals the death of the human person as a whole. Okay, now the reason this is important is because sometimes when you talk to people about brain death, they'll say, we'll prove that brain death is not the death of the human person. That's the wrong question. The burden of proof is on those who say that it is. Why do I say that? Because they're the ones that are trying to liberalize the criteria of death. And it's because of organ transplant. If there weren't heart transplants, we wouldn't even be having this conversation about brain death. The reason this matters is because literally without brain death, many types of transplants would not be possible. Most heart transplants in the United States are because of people who are declared brain dead. If they weren't able to declare people brain dead, there would not be heart transplants, generally speaking. Now, it's an oversimplification. There are other types of death. There's the Pittsburgh protocol, where your heart stops beating for 2 minutes and they could still resuscitate it, and they don't, and they get the transplant team there and they transfer it. So that's also, I would argue, wrong, because the heart could still be resuscitated at that point. But in general, most heart transplants are through death by neurological criteria. That's why this is such an important issue, and there's so many people that are advocating for it. So I want to, kind of present that as the initial starting point, the biological medical argument, and then I want to go into the philosophical and theological argument. So before I go on, are there any further questions you want me to address, Maria?
So far, we're doing good. We're not getting anybody on the chat box asking any questions. It'd be really good to wait to the very end. But wait, I do have one. Okay, hold on. Just when I said that. The question is, how do we educate a patient's family if the patient had a DNR? Hold on one second. Let me just double check that. Yes. How do we educate a patient's family if the patient had a DNR? Many nurses get upset if family members get involved.
Yeah, right. So this is a very good question, and thank you very much, Kimberly. This is a really wonderful question. I'll answer this question in two ways. First of all, as a Catholic, my opinion is that I would advocate patients not to sign a DNR. Okay, and the reason for that is because the way that they define do not resuscitate can be very broad. In other words, there may be a circumstance where resuscitating somebody could have a beneficial impact and extend their life significantly or help them in some way. But if they have a DNR and they just decide not to resuscitate the person, then they no longer have that option. I think that's something that the healthcare proxy, the patient's family, should make at the time that it happens. I would not sign a DNR. I would not sign a post form. I think that these are ways of taking away the rights of the family and transferring them to medical professionals. And quite frankly, I don't think that that's what medical professionals should be doing. The role of healthcare professionals, nurses and doctors, is to serve patients, to advocate for them, to protect their life, not to make decisions about which life is worthy, who's worthy of life and who's not, and who would benefit from an organ transplant and who's not. The practice of organ donation generally has changed the trajectory of healthcare in a negative direction, in my opinion. But to answer your question specifically about the DNR, patients many times, their family is there as a support system to advocate for them. And so, if it's your spouse, if it's your parent, if it's your sibling, you have a right to know what's going on with their care. And so I would say that if it's a situation, without giving you legal advice, speaking as an ethicist, as a bioethicist, from a moral perspective, you would prayerfully consider this is something the family may have a right to know. If the patient is being treated in such a way and you feel like the family is being shut out, not included in that decision-making process, or not even informed of what's going on with their loved one, that can be an injustice. And if your conscience is telling you as a nurse that you need the support of the family, then you might need to take that up with your nurse supervisor. I know, Maria, you know a thing or two about nurse supervisor. You're a nurse supervisor, and you would need to say, Maria, whoever your nurse supervisor is, I have a real conscientious concern that this patient's family has a right to know what's going on with their loved one, and I would like to communicate to them. And what's the appropriate protocol for doing that? And work with your healthcare system to try to facilitate that, because what happened, quite frankly, during the pandemic, when patients were were denied visitors in healthcare settings. I'm sorry, but you don't have the right to tell me I can't visit my loved ones.
Amen.
That's a fundamental human right. They should have never done that. It is an abuse of the human person. Hospitals are not prisons.
Amen.
Period. They're not prisons. You do not. Now, I'm not saying you can't have reasonable protocols regarding how many people at one time. You can't have social distancing. I'm not saying there's no room for health and safety to protect the patient. But when you have a categorical policy which says you cannot have anybody visit you, you're basically saying you have no advocate. Because if a person doesn't know what medication you're on, if they don't know how you're being treated, if they can't talk to you, if they can't see you, you have no advocacy. Your life is entirely in the hands of the people treating you, and you have the right to the support of your loved ones. I issued an article with a number of physicians from the two physicians, a nurse and a doctor from the Catholic Medical Association, Natalie Roden and Ashley Fernandez. We talked about the critical role of families in helping patients to heal. If a patient has a family member that's there, walking with them, loving them, supporting them, they get better quicker. There is a marked increase in their progress. So I do think that it's important that patients are there, that their family is there with them, that they have an opportunity to advocate for their loved ones, and the hospital should be facilitating these relationships with the family members and not creating situations where there's a breakdown in communication and the person doesn't know what's going on with their loved one.
So Michael, I just wanted to add to that. We did have someone share that their patients were able to, and Kimberly is saying thank you. So thank you again, Kim, for sharing that. We did have somebody share that in their hospital, they use tablets and so forth. And that came at the end where I worked at the hospital, the end of the scenario of COVID, but I don't want to get too much into that. Here's the deal. Not all our patients can use a tablet. Not all our patients can even hear, let alone write. Some are contracted, some can't write. The fact is that patient should have a right to see their family member. In regards to your right of conscience, as that is starting to come up right now with a concern that is your patient aware or the family really have good knowledge here before they make that decision for DNR. You have a concern and your conscience is really bothering you. Michael is absolutely right. You need to go to your nursing supervisor. Now, if that nursing supervisor doesn't listen to you and you're still having this issue, there are more people. You can call your head nurse, you call your manager, you have a text, you keep on going, or ask your peers if they could switch the assignment. Usually this is going to happen in an ICU. That's usually where it's going to be. So nurses in an ICU tend to work as a team and should be able to switch off. These are just a little suggestions. We'll go deeper. Michael, I just wanted to highlight some of the main things that I'm hearing from the very get-go, very concerning. When you said, when this started out with Harvard Medical School and how one of their ideas of why they felt they had to have a definition for brain death was really because they felt there was a concern that there wasn't enough organ donations. That is a major, that should be like highlighted to everybody right now. The second thing is that's really strong in my heart is that the only teaching I'm hearing you saying that the church clearly has is the brain donor. Am I getting brain? Is it
the dead donor rule?
That's the only clear, distinctive church teaching we have that says if you want to take a heart from someone, they've got to be dead. No heart beating, no breathing, nothing, dead. And I think that really, those are the two big things that you're teaching for me that is sticking out very clear. I want to make sure everybody has heard that as we continue on. So thank you, Mr. Vacca. I want to let you know too, as far as time goes, because I know that, you're doing a great job with time. It's usually me that has the problem. We are at the 8 o'clock moment. So we have about 15 minutes or so, maybe a little more for you to continue on with your presentation before we go into Q&A.
Okay. So real briefly, I'm going to say one more thing on the biological medical piece, and then we're going to go into the philosophy and theology. So I want to propose something here, and that's that, this is increasingly there are more and more people that are realizing this in the church. There is, as I alluded to earlier, there is an inconsistency those advocating for brain death have. They have an inconsistency between the beginning of life and the end of life. And let me explain what I mean. The church teaches very clearly, I'm not getting into the whole ensoulment debate of when the soul enters the embryo, but the church teaches very clearly that the embryo has to be treated as a human person. Okay, you have to treat the embryo as a human person because the presumption is that the soul is present in the embryo. There's debates about when that ensoulment happens, but the church teaches very clearly you have to treat the embryo as a person. Okay. The embryo, when the embryo is formed, does not have a functioning brain. So let me understand this correctly. You have the church saying that you have to treat the embryo as a human person that does not have a brain. And yet at the end of life, we're told that the brain is the coordinating center of the human person, and that if you don't have a functioning brain, you're not a person. But wait a second, I thought you said that the embryo was a person without a brain, and now you're saying that you have to have a brain to be a person. So explain this to me. Explain to me this philosophy, because I'm a little confused between the beginning of life and the end of life. And the people advocating for brain death will say, Michael, no, you don't understand. I said, well, what don't I understand? They said, once that brain develops, it takes over the human person and becomes the coordinating center of the human person. Really, what proof do you have for that? I thought that the church taught that the soul was the center of the human person. You seem to think it's the brain. Are you saying that the brain is the soul? What exactly is your position? Because it sounds to me like you're making a philosophical, theological argument, not a medical, biological argument. So let's be real clear. The people advocating for brain death are not making a medical, biological argument. They're making a philosophical, theological argument. They're making a moral argument that the church needs to address. And if it doesn't, it's going to have catastrophic implications. So I'm going to go into now that philosophical, theological argument, but I want to point out the inconsistency between, on the one hand, saying the embryo is a person without a brain, and on the other hand, that at the end of life, you have to have a functioning brain to be a living human person. This is absolutely unacceptable, inconsistent, and it doesn't make any sense. So let's talk about the official anthropology of the Catholic Church. I argue, and again, I am not saying you're not a good Catholic if you don't agree with me, because the church doesn't have an official position. But I do hope and pray that the church does declare that it is morally illicit to define death strictly through neurological criteria, because I believe that that's the right view. So I want to talk about the official anthropology of the church. The Council of Vienne in the year 1311 through 1312 said this. This is the official anthropology of the Catholic Church. I want to be really clear. This is the most definitive statement that the church has issued about the anthropology of the human person. This is from 1311. The church said this. In order that all may know the truth of the faith and its purity, and all error may be excluded. Okay, so this is the church is saying we're about to define something very important. So pay attention. We define, this is authoritative language. This is not a provisional suggestion. This is official church teaching. We, the church, define that anyone who presumes henceforth to assert, defend, or hold stubbornly that the rational or intellectual soul is not the form of the human body of itself and essentially is to be considered a heretic. All right, so let me review and break down what the church just said in that statement from 1311. The church says if you don't acknowledge that the human person is a composite of body and soul, if you say that the soul is not the very form of the body, this is essentially from Aquinas and Aristotle. The church basically took Aquinas's anthropology and made it church teaching. Okay, if you say that the soul is not the form of the body, substantially in and of itself, you're a heretic. If you say that the human person, some people act as if the human person is a soul trapped in a body, as if like my body is not me. I have a body, not I am a body. That's heresy. I don't have a body. I am a body-soul composite. Michael Vacca is not just a soul or just a body. I'm a body-soul composite. Every human person, Maria Ravonio, is body and soul, right? We're all body and soul. The church is saying that the relationship between the soul and the body is such that as long as the body is alive, we have to presume that the soul is still present, because the principle of life of the body is the soul. So if you have a beating heart, if you have circulation at the respiratory level, you can't safely say the person is dead. What's responsible for that? You can't say it's the ventilator. No, the ventilator doesn't cause the heart to beat. Can't do that. The ventilator can facilitate that by pumping air in, but something in the body is working, and we have to assume that the soul is still present so long as the body itself is working. So the anthropology of the church is that every human being, I want to be clear about this, every human being is a human person. There are various people promoting the culture of death who say, yeah, we acknowledge that they're a human being, but they're not a person. The embryo, they're a human being, but they're not a person. The brain dead patient, they're a human being, but they're not a person. The PVS patient, they're a human being, but they're not a person. According to what is the criteria of personhood? According to some subjective criteria, according to whether they're conscious, according to, by the way, this is what the revisions to the Uniform Determination of Death Act, now they're suggesting that, this is coming out in July of this year, that they want to redefine death so only those who are conscious can be alive, and anybody that's unconscious would be declared dead under this criteria. So you have to understand, right, that they're pushing the boundary further and further and further. The Catholic position is that if you are a human being, you are a human person. There is no philosophical or theological justification in Catholic teaching for separating a human being from a human person. Any criteria that attempts to do that is arbitrary and capricious. I don't care what criteria you come up with, it's not rational and it is not consistent with the Catholic anthropology of the human person. Okay, so let's talk about the dogma of, or the teaching of brain death here. The teaching of brain death regards the union between the soul and the body as mediated by the brain. Okay, it says that the connection between the soul and the body is through the brain. But if that's true, that the brain is the mediator between the soul and the body, that would mean that the soul would be accidentally connected to the body, not of itself and essentially, as the Council of Vienne requires. Right? So the Catholic position is that there's such a close union between the soul and the body that it's not mediated by any physical thing. It's so connected and thoroughly imbued that anywhere that the body is operating, you presume that the soul is present. People advocating for brain death want to say that it's the brain that is the sole mediator between the body and the soul. And that is a position that contradicts the Catholic anthropology of the human person, and it contradicts the official anthropology of the church at the Council of Vienne. Okay, so the church requires the non-localization of the soul, right? This means that the soul is not confined to the brain. It's not confined to the heart. It's through and through imbued throughout the human person. You cannot separate the body and the soul. In fact, the separation of the body and soul is what we mean by death. As long as the body is alive, as long as the heart is beating, as long as there's respiration, as long as there's functional activity in the human person, we have to assume morally that the soul is still present, that the person is still alive. If you're out hunting and you see movement and you're not sure if it's a deer or a person, and you shoot and it's a person, you're very likely to go to jail. right? And if you go before the court and they say, well, I didn't mean to kill the person, said, well, did you check that it was a person before you shot? No, I just assumed. Well, that's not murder, but it's certainly culpable, right? And people have gone to jail for that, right? You have a moral responsibility to make sure that you're not killing a human person. If you are not sure that the person is dead or alive, you better treat them as if they're alive. Because one day when we end up before the tribunal of God, God is going to say, what did you do to advocate for my people? If you are not sure that that person is dead and your conscience as a nurse is telling you this patient is alive, you have a moral obligation to advocate for that patient. Doesn't matter what anybody else is doing. Your obligation to that patient is to treat them as if they're alive. Okay. Either the soul informs every part of the body substantially and directly, or it informs the whole body accidentally and indirectly via the brain. It can't be both ways. The official teaching of the church is that the soul informs the body directly and essentially, and it is not mediated by any organ, including the brain. So I argue philosophically, theologically, that brain death and those advocating for it are not making a Catholic argument, that although the church has not definitively rejected it, that if you look at it, it's not consistent with a Catholic understanding of the human person. Okay.
Michael, I just want to interrupt 1 second, just so I don't lose this question. Diana's asking for a copy of the Council of Vienna, the one that you just shared.
Sure. Papal encyclicals.net, and I can send this to you, Maria, to send out.
And I can send it out to everybody.
Right. Yeah. But if you go to papalencyclicals.net and you type in Council of Vienna, it's a list of all the church's ecumenical councils. You will see the text there, and you'll see the language that I quoted from. So that's very important and a great resource for people. So I want to say here that one of the mistakes I believe advocates of brain death are making is that I believe it's a reductionist philosophy of the human person. I believe that, this really comes from Descartes. Descartes believed that it was the soul trapped in the body. And I believe the advocates of brain death in many cases are replacing the soul with the brain. Instead of saying that the soul is the center of the human person, they're saying the brain has metaphysical significance, it's the center of the human person, or they're saying that the soul only exists in the brain, which again is in conflict with Catholic teaching, because the church teaching is that the union between the body and the soul is direct and substantial and not mediated indirectly by any organ. So I think it's a reductionist philosophy of the human person. Many times those in favor of brain death will do these thought experiments about organs ex utero outside the body, and they'll say, well, what if this organ is cut off from the body? Is this alive? And they'll do all these thought experiments. The fact is, if you have a human person that's intact, they have a beating heart, they have respiration, they have other signs of life, we cannot safely say that the soul has left their body. Let's let God be God and decide when the person dies, and stop trying to presume that we know more than we do. Okay, I also want to say that I think brain death can be, I'm going to say can be, because there's an attempt by Catholic ethicists to try and get around this. I don't think it's successful. It can be a materialist philosophy, right? Because the brain, notice they're not saying the mind. They say the brain. The brain is a physical organ. You can control the brain, right? The brain can be measured. They can do an EEG. They can test the blood flow. There are a lot of measurements that can be done on the brain. The brain is something that you can touch. It's tangible. It can be acted upon directly. The mind, neurologists talk about the mind. Well, what's the mind? The mind is not a physical thing. The mind is the projection of the soul. When you think, when you reason, when you feel, it changes your brain. This is called by neurologists neuroplasticity. So neurologists know that the brain isn't the center of the human person. The mind is the center of the human person. And they only say mind and not soul because they don't want to be religious and they need to stay secular. So they say the mind is the center of the human person. But the fact is that even neurology doesn't treat the brain as the center of the human person. It recognizes a more primary reality, which they refer to as the mind. Okay, so when they're taking a physical organ of the brain that they can act directly upon, and they're saying the life of the human person is not in the soul, it's not the soul that determines the human person, it's the brain, you're transitioning the central locus of the human person from an immaterial spiritual reality to a material reality that can be manipulated and controlled. So nobody can directly affect the soul. If I wanted to attack somebody's soul, I can't directly do that. It's not a physical reality. But if somebody hits me over the head, they can cause severe injury to my brain and to my person. Okay, so by transitioning the center of the human person from a spiritual reality, the soul, to a physical, tangible reality, the brain, I argue what they're doing is transitioning authority from God to man.
Amen.
They're saying we get to control when people are alive and dead. I understand something. We live in a culture of death by fiat. My brother-in-law was in the hospital after overdosing on drugs, and I sat next to him in the hospital. I looked at him. He was not dead. I looked him in the eye. He was definitely not dead. And they said the doctors have declared him dead. Well, with all due respect to those medical professionals, you don't have the authority to declare when somebody has died. That's God's job.
Amen.
Death is an objective biological reality. Just because if you were sitting in a medical facility and somebody came up to you and said you're dead, you would laugh them out of the room. They can't, you can't declare that somebody is dead that's not dead, right? This isn't death by fiat. There has to be an objective, rational, biological basis for death. And if you want to tell me they expect me to believe that people with a beating heart are dead, I'm sorry, I don't believe that. I don't believe that people, that cadavers have beating hearts. I think if you have a beating heart, you're a live human person and you should be given the right to life just like every other person, like the embryo, like every other child. It is morally illicit, in my opinion, and unconscionable to be treating people with beating hearts as if they're dead cadavers.
Amen. Michael, your presentation is just beautiful. It's just that we're 25 after 8. People, I'm going to ask you to use the chat box. If you can stay a little longer, we welcome you to stay. I'd actually have to ask Michael if he's able to stay a little bit past the 8:30 mark, because we only have 5 more minutes. But if you can stay a little longer and everyone on this recording can stay, I'm getting people saying yes so far, because there are questions coming. And before I get to those questions, you still had a little bit more that you wanted to speak on. I did want to make sure we put in there the concern that there's another way that they're identifying death, and that's circulatory death that you spoke about to me personally. And I'm concerned about that for us nurses as well.
Yeah.
Can you share what that is?
Right. So, there's without going into the weeds on it, because it would require a whole nother presentation, there is something called the DCD protocol. And DCD stands for donation after circulatory death. Okay. And what this is, for example, in the Pittsburgh protocol, which is an example of this, you have a patient and they disconnect them from the ventilator, their heart stops beating. They got their stopwatches out. After 2 minutes, they got the transplant team waiting. The transplant team comes in. Now, you understand that normally cardiorespiratory death, you nurses know this, it would be 15 to 20 minutes before you couldn't restart the person's heart. If the person's heart has only been stopped for 2 minutes, you could do the paddles and resuscitate them. They've made a decision, we're not going to resuscitate this person, but if we wait too long, their heart won't be viable. We won't be able to benefit another patient. So technically they're dead because their heart stopped beating, but then we're going to wait 2 minutes and we're going to rip the beating heart. We're going to rip the heart out of their chest, which at this point hasn't been beating for 2 minutes, although it could be resuscitated, and we're going to give it to another patient. So this is referred to as donation after circulatory death. Again, this isn't respecting the human person, because the person could still be resuscitated. It's contrived. They are basically grooming the person to take their organs the moment that they possibly can, so that they're still viable. Again, this is all about organ transplantation. It's not about the dignity of the human person.
Amen.
So that's what I'll say about DCD.
Thank you. Michael, one of the questions we're getting from Nancy, and Nancy McGrath is asking, if they are planning to define death as unconsciousness, how will they ensure protection during surgery?
Yeah, it's a great question, because it's pretty common that you have to, you have your anesthesiologist that put people out during surgery. How do you ensure that somebody, it's very dangerous. And there, quite frankly, I was on the phone last week with a medical professional neurologist who's perfectly fine with brain death. And he was gravely concerned about this. And he said, Michael, they are trying to relativize and subjectivize death. And so even the people that are in favor of brain death are very concerned about this. It's a very good question. I don't know the answer to that question. The answer is they shouldn't be defining death based on consciousness, because medically there's no consistent theory of consciousness. They don't fully understand consciousness, number one. And number two, the fact is, we know that there are many people that are unconscious that are alive, that are showing signs of life. So the idea that they're going to define somebody dead just because they're not conscious is absurd. And it should not even be contemplated by medical professionals in all seriousness.
So I guess your answer in a way is kind of answering a question that Pat Sayers is bringing up. Dr. Sayers, our president of NACN, is asking that, how do you define unconsciousness? How do we do that? That's really, after all this, is going to be a real issue.
Yeah, well, there is no, my understanding, reading the literature and speaking to neurologists, is that there is no convincing objective theory of consciousness. There's a lot they don't understand about why people are and even people there are people who have been declared brain dead, and they will have a recovery and they'll say, oh yeah, I heard what was being said about me. Or I was, so you might think that patient doesn't have the ability to hear what you're saying, and they might be totally aware of what's going on. So we simply do not know. Consciousness is a complicated reality. It is extremely complex. We are not nearly in a position to be able to understand this thoroughly, and it definitely is not an adequate criteria for death.
Okay, Dr. Sayers wants to make a comment real short, because I have a few more questions up here. Dr. Sayers, you're welcome to comment. Just put yourself on speaker. Can you do that? Let me see where she's at. Hold on 1 second. Let me see if I can get you, Pat, to put you on speaker here. You should be able to, Pat.
Okay. All right.
There you are, girl.
Mary Lee Meehan told me this. She only observed it once as an ER nurse, and I've never heard another ER nurse say this. But they were trying to resuscitate someone, and you have a cart. You have only so many medications and everything in it. They went through 3 carts. This person, the person who was leading the code, said, and they thought the gentleman was unconscious, is there anyone here that feels we should continue this? And there was silence. And all of a sudden, his hand went like that.
Wow.
Yeah.
And so they did one more round and he went up to the ICU. They thought he was unconscious. They thought he was gone. but he heard exactly what they were saying. Anyway, I had to make that comment about consciousness.
Pat, I just thank you so much for sharing that, because that really resonates. There was a gentleman, Zachary Dunlap, was in an ATV accident, flipped over on an ATV, was declared brain dead. He lives a complete normal human life right now.
Yeah.
And he made a recovery. So obviously he was not dead, even though he was declared brain dead, because he's alive and living. And he actually made a complete recovery. So many times people are shocked because they don't expect when somebody is declared dead to be seeing signs of life. And sometimes they see them.
I had a personal experience in the ER where
Yeah, I was going to say.
it just happened to me about months ago. Patients in the emergency room, and they were all around her. They coded her several times, and they said, "There's no hope." The doctor declared her dead. Okay, declared dead. They had put the things that they put under the patient to get them ready for the morgue. But since she was in the ER, they didn't tie it all up because she was going to be for an ME case and she died at the ER. An hour later, they forgot to take the monitor off. Her heart starts beating on the monitor. An hour later, okay? I was the supervisor on, praise God, because they all said, "Now, what do we do? It's going to be missing." But, and what do you mean, what do you do? She's alive. You need to go over there and treat her. Well, she was declared dead. She's not dead. Okay, they said that can't be possible. Excuse me, why not? God works awesome miracles. And it was a really beautiful time to bring about what God can do, and also the fact of what you're saying, Mr. Vacca, that truly a person is not dead. They have a beating heart and they have a soul. And that person is very much alive. We also had a priest that said the same thing that Dr. Sayers is saying. And you were saying earlier, that person hears. The priest talked about a patient that was presumed dead. They were going to, they said, "That's it, the person's dead." Person woke up and then told everybody he heard everything they said.
Did you know, Maria, that the official, when the church administers the last rites to somebody, there's a provision in canon law which allows them to do it within so long because of when the patient has been declared dead. So if a patient has been declared dead, the understanding of the church is that they may not be dead because it's difficult to know the precise moment when death happens. And so in case they're alive, they're allowed to do the final last rites for that person.
Yes.
And the apostolic pardon and all of that, they're able to do that because the church in her wisdom recognizes that God is the author of life and death. It's very difficult to determine that. And, if it weren't for the issue of organ donation, this would be a mute issue. It'd be like, so what if it takes another 15, 20 minutes, 3 hours to declare the person dead? It's because they want to take their organs that this is becoming such an issue. This is all about organ donation. Organ donation has changed the practice of medicine from the good of the patient in front of you to physicians, medical professionals making quality of life determinations about, how the person in front of them should be treated. Every patient deserves respect for undeniable respect for them as a person. The question shouldn't be, how can this benefit another person? The question should be, what is best for my patient? And I have a moral obligation to do everything I can to protect the life of my patient. That needs to be the focus of healthcare, not a utilitarian ends justify the means mentality.
Amen. We have another question.
Diana, yeah, go ahead. You're going
We have a question. We have a question from Sarah McNamee, asking and requesting if you, Mr. Vacca, have read the book written by Matthew Hanley, Determining Death by Neurological Criteria. And if so, what are your thoughts? She's asking.
Yeah, so I have read Dr. Hanley's book, and I do not find it persuasive. He makes some credible claims, but I think that he makes some philosophical and theological mistakes. I have no doubt he means well as a physician, but I don't think that his position is consistent with Catholic teaching.
Thank you. Another question from Kimberly Wohead. God bless Kimberly. She's identifying Rene Descartes. She's asking if you could elaborate on Rene Descartes' thought the soul was in the pituitary gland. She says, I'm not sure I get what the reductionist theory is arguing. Please clarify if possible.
Okay, so Descartes, the most famous saying of Descartes, Rene Descartes was a French philosopher. You probably know him as saying, I think, therefore I am.
Way back in college, way back.
That's one of his most famous philosophical sayings.
Yes.
So he predicates his existence on the ability to think. Now, brain death is what? It's about the brain, the organ of thinking, right? Descartes believed, if you read his philosophical writings, that really it was the soul that was the human person, and that people had a body, but it was like their soul was trapped in their body. You know, if you ever go to some funerals, you'll see they'll open a cage and they'll let the white bird, the dove, fly away, and it's like the person's soul is leaving their body. Well, that I'm not dismissing that, but that is not a Catholic view of the human person. We don't believe that we're a soul trapped in a body. We believe that we're a body-soul composite. Right? We don't just believe in the resurrection of the soul. We believe, what do we say in the creed? We believe in the resurrection of the body. So Aquinas said that if you were to say that the soul is going to be resurrected, you have to say that the body will be resurrected with the soul, because it's unnatural for the soul to be separated from the body. So Descartes did not have a Catholic anthropology of the human person. He was a dualist. He believed that the soul and the body were separate. In Catholic teaching, the soul is not separate from the body. The soul is integrated thoroughly in the body, right? Brain death, I would argue, like Descartes, is a dualist philosophy, right? Because what it suggests is that the union between the soul and the body is mediated by the brain. And if the brain isn't there, then poof, the soul leaves the body. As if the union between the soul and the body was just reducible to one organ. No, the soul permeates every aspect of the body. My hand is body and soul. My heart is body and soul. My foot is body and soul. Not just my brain, every part of my body is body and soul. So because Descartes is a dualist, and because he bases his theory of the human person strictly upon the mind, I think, therefore I am, I believe, and others have argued, Dr. Dorian Nguyen has made this argument convincingly in her book. She wrote a book on the new criteria for the determination of death. And she says, an organ donation. And she talks about how Descartes, the philosophy of Descartes, had a substantive impact upon the theory of brain death. And I believe that that's true.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. We do have a few more questions. I'm trying to tell it. Let's see what we got here. Hold on one second. And this is about the financial aspect of all this. Sarah McNamee, and I apologize if I'm not saying your last names correctly, says, I've noticed an uptick in organ donation at my hospital. Is there a financial benefit for hospital systems? That ought to be quite interesting.
Okay, so I'm going to speak very clearly. I don't know the ins and the outs. I'm not I am not a hospital administrator, but I can tell you that organ donation is a multi-billion-dollar business.
Yes.
Billion with a B. All right, we know that Live Action went undercover and they discovered that Planned Parenthood was involved in selling aborted baby parts. This was a huge scandal. We know in China there's forced organ harvesting, which is a huge human rights abuse. And quite frankly, I believe that a lot of the problems in healthcare have to do with the profit motive with organ donation. So I absolutely believe that financial motives affect determinations at the end of life, and that there is a huge profit motive behind organ donation. And there are many people who, quite frankly, are such huge proponents of organ donation that it, I believe, blinds them to the reality of the appropriate biological understanding of death.
I agree. I mean, one of the things when you work at the hospital, you get a nice letter. If you haven't gotten one yet, I know our hospital often gets letters. Thank you so much for helping with what they call the harvesting of the organs. And we are basically told we must call and identify, even before the doctor says the patient's not looking good. The nurses are usually the first ones that are contacting the team to let them know this is a potential person or patient that you may want to look at. It's really just last week.
My concern,
critical.
my concern is, and you know, I'll just say this. I'll be very transparent. I did a podcast with Human Life International, and I told people it was all about organ donation, and I said very directly, if I were in your situation, I mean this very seriously. I tell everybody I meet, do not sign up to be an organ donor on your driver's license. Do not.
Right.
Why
Right.
would I do that? Isn't that a heroic act of love? I remember I went one time and the lady looked at me like, you don't want to save people's lives? Like I was a heartless monster. No, listen, if I'm not clear that I'm actually dead, I am not going to risk anyone taking my life before God's ready to take it. And you should have the same respect for your life. So I advocate that people, until we get objective clarity about the moment of death, people should not, in my opinion, sign up to be organ donors. If they want to donate their skin cells after they die or something like that, that's fine. But in terms of donating vital organs and things like that, you have to make sure that the person is dead. Otherwise, you risk being euthanized. And I simply do not think that we live in a culture in which, when you, my opinion, Maria, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but my opinion is that if they see that on your driver's license that you want to be an organ donor, they're not going to be super concerned in many cases to do everything that they can to ensure your right to life. They're going to be seeing you more as an organ donor than as a patient with the right to life.
Right.
I think that is a tragedy and an abuse of the human person.
And you have to worry also about when you're signing your living will. Recently, I met that up with a patient, a friend. Your living will also, or that, you know, if you don't have one before you get in the hospital, you're definitely going to be offered it. And on it in very small print, they have about organ donation. Okay. And then if my friend was really getting really nervous because she had to go to this, you know, she was going to the OR. And the person said, oh, you know what? Don't worry, your family will help you. No. This is the patient's right. The patient has a right to understand what they're signing, and it's their choice, not their family's choice. It's between them and God. So that has to be really pointed out on those living wills. We do have some more questions, and it's getting very late, and I'm very grateful. We're having people saying thank you very much, Mr. Vacca, for offering this time. There is a question. Hold on. Let me just see if I can get this. I know there was a comment. Barbara McCormick has a comment. Barbara, put yourself on mute and share that, please.
Well, I won't go into it, but I just wanted to, you know, our ERs right now are short. We're staffing is short. You know, resources have been, and then COVID on top of it, it's made it quite rough. I had one example. I did transport real quick, and I got called to a gentleman walked in wearing a life vest, and he collapsed and cardiac arrested, and he needed to be resuscitated multiple times. But the nurse said to me, he's there. And the doc said to me, it's up to you. So I loaded additional resources, and we made it to a different hospital. Thank God it was like 3:00 in the morning. And we lost him a couple times, brought him back, but he walked out of the hospital 3 days later because the cath lab was open and they took care of him. But that was I see now, and I've heard doctors tell me that we are very quick to go to palliative care in our critical care units. I haven't been at the bedside at the critical care in the last couple of years. Well, I was COVID 2 and 3, but I didn't realize how quick they were making decisions to palliative care, and not necessarily organ donation. And my last point was, as a young nurse many years ago, I had one of the most spiritual times that it kind of tested my faith. Was I had hospice in the ICU to a priest and titrated his morphine drip, and I just found that a very unique episode. But thank you very much for all this discussion. It really is enlightening.
Thank you so much. I really
Thank
appreciate it.
you.
And I appreciate your comment about transitioning patients to palliative care inappropriately and too soon. You know, palliative care in and of itself is fine, because the theory of it is that if you can't cure the patient, make them comfortable and, treat them with respect and dignity. But this idea that you should, as soon as you transfer them to palliative care, stop trying to cure them, and it just becomes about, keeping them comfortable. Many times that can involve a hasty attempt to stop curing the person, stop treating them, and it can become, well, we just don't want to bother to fight for this person's life. And so I don't think that palliative care should be the central focus of medicine. I think that the central focus of medicine should be curing patients and restoring them to health. I think that the alleviation of pain and suffering is obviously part of healthcare, but when we stop trying to cure people that can possibly be cured, and we just keep them comfortable, many times that's a failure to love the patient and to give them the optimal care that we can give them.
Thank you, Mr. Vacca. Michael, thank you so much. I mean, this information, it is getting late, and we kept people on. I think we've lost maybe just 4 people out of the whole thing that were anxiously staying on to hear you. Just to highlight a few things again, you clearly told us what the church's teachings were on this. I appreciate that the only clear teaching is the dead donor rule. You gave us the history of how it all started and how one of the reasons was related to organ donation. You identified for us how the ventilator, as we nurses know, do not keep that patient alive per se. That doesn't say whether that patient is alive, how many patients we've taken off the vent, and families sit there and say to me, they're not dead. No kidding, because the ventilator is not the reason they're alive. It's God. He's in control of life and death. Amen. So we have seen that physically as nurses. We're blessed to be Catholic nurses. That helps us hold on to that more. But I am sure with all my heart that the information you shared tonight would give us some concerns in our heart now when we go back and care for our patients, whatever role that we're in, that we need to start thinking about, how does this affect our conscience? You need to be able to be aware that when you go in that ICU, or if you work in the ER, sometimes we keep our patients in the ER. We have no beds in the unit. So you're with that kind of a patient waiting for that team to come in to harvest. So we need to be aware of these things beforehand and start to either, one, I pray that I don't get those patients when I walk in, pray that I don't have to deal with that issue. Lord, please give it to someone else, if anything. Pray that that doesn't even happen to our patients. Recently, I was in an ICU and I heard them say, oh no, they don't have to wait till they go upstairs to the OR. They're declared dead now. Why? Because the doctor said they were brain dead. Oh, okay. So we have to look at our right of conscience. Go to your sources. You're concerned, like Michael was saying and I'm saying, go to your nursing supervisor. Let them know right away. Go to the charge nurse on that shift and say, look, I cannot do this. It's against my conscience.
Maria, I
Yes.
just want to say, because what you're saying is very prophetic. I just want to say on that, and I'm so grateful for you saying this, that the Holy Spirit's putting it on my heart. I think some of you on this call have been in the past, or will be in situations when your conscience is telling you a patient is not dead, but you will be maybe intimidated by the doctors or other people saying they are, and well, I'm just a nurse and they're a doctor, and so I can't challenge this, or I can't challenge my hospital, or whatever the case is. You know what? if you are speaking the truth and your conscience is convicting you, you are doing it for the Lord. You're not responsible for the result, but you advocate for that patient. You love them. You're their best chance at life at that moment. And you don't know that God hasn't put you there to advocate for that patient. There are patients alive today that had a courageous nurse by them. And if they didn't have that nurse, they wouldn't be alive today. So I just want to encourage you, don't be intimidated. Medical professionals are wonderful. I'm not there to criticize them, but don't be intimidated. If your conscience is telling you the patient is alive, God is the author of life, and no doctor, no medical professional has the right to say otherwise.
Amen. Amen. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Holy Spirit, for sharing that through Michael. Michael, if anybody wants to get in touch with you, I know you're a spiritual director here, you're a Catholic lawyer, Catholic bioethicist. How does someone reach you? Because I know that Christ Medicus also, with you being there, has things you can offer.
Yeah, so anybody is welcome to contact me. As I mentioned, I work with the Christ Medicus Foundation and head up our Healthcare Civil Rights Task Force. I'll put my email in the chat right now and my phone number, so anybody can contact me with any questions. I do bioethics consult, so if anyone has questions about, have a situation with a patient and what's the morally correct thing to do, I'm happy to have those conversations. I do serve as a spiritual director, and I'm very happy to pray with you. I love, my wife and I do intercessory prayer, so if any of you need prayer, we'd love to do that as well.
Thank you. And could you also include in your chat the name of the article? It was very long. I know it's been coming out in August.
Oh, my article.
Yeah.
My article that's coming. So my article is coming out in the Literature Quarterly. It was accepted for publication, which is run. It's the oldest bioethics journal in the country, published by the Catholic Medical Association. So this is a wonderful thing that it's coming out in August, and you all will be able to see it. It's called The Moral Illicitness of Relying Solely on Neurological Criteria for the Determination of Death, a Catholic Response to Brain Death.
Thank you, Michael. And again, for all of you that have come tonight to listen to this presentation, we're very grateful that you came in from all different walks of life as nurses, bedside managers, supervisors, CEOs, professors of nursing, priest, and bioethicists we have on. So thank you very much. I'd be interested in hearing your input and evaluation, so please feel free to send them. Also, just know too, if you're not a member, please make sure you check out our website, nacnusa.org. Right on the screen, you can find out about how to be a member. If you're not Catholic, you're Christian. The biggest thing is that you're accepting the moral teachings of the Catholic Church. So please look into joining us. We are for life from the time of conception to the time of natural death. And that's why this particular presentation is being offered, to make sure that we understand that patient is not dead until they're dead. Until they have no heartbeat, none. Remember the old-fashioned way we used to get the stethoscope and listen? What are those deals, Anyway, just to be a little funny at the end. But Lord, I pray that in thanksgiving and blessings, so grateful that your father joined us and your wife. So thank you very much for them coming on. And Michael, may I ask you for a prayer for all of us before you leave?
Oh, sure. That's very kind. We don't have, just want to clarify, we don't have any priests or deacons with us, do we?
We had a priest. Yeah, well, we have a brother. Brother Ignatius is with us.
Brother, would you be comfortable? I would defer to you because you are a brother.
Yes, you are. Please, can you get on the screen with us, Brother Ignatius?
Yes, I can.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I would defer to you to please lead us in prayer.
The video doesn't come up, but anyway, can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yes.
we can
Yes,
hear
I
you.
hear you.
Lord, we thank you for bringing us together, to sharing this significant information that will direct our practice, continue to give us moral courage to care for ourselves, as well as for our patients, to do the right thing that's in keeping with God's plan for all of us. Give us the strength to, as the largest group of health professionals in the world, to begin to continue the process of transforming healthcare, where human dignity, freedom, and human flourishing are the benchmarks of the practice of the trilogy of nursing and healthcare. Amen.
Amen. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, brother.
Thank you all very much. And
Thank you, Maria. Thank
we
you,
will
Michael.
have more of these, we hope, and we'll keep it going. So thank you, Mr. Vacca. Thank you, all of you. All right, good night now, and God bless.
Maria, thank you for having me. God bless you.
Oh,
and
thank
everything
you,
do
Michael.
for our Lord.
We'll see you soon. Bye-bye now.
God bless.